Creating conversations that you can share forward. That's what arrow.net is all about. ARROE.net. We are unplugged and totally uncut with David S. Rudolf.
I'm good. That's quite a picture you've got on the screen there.
Yeah, that was taken as a radio station promotion, and they said, we want you to showcase yourself. And I'm going, okay, if you're going to let me be myself, I'm going to go ahead and do it. And so I took the flying V in there, and then that's a coup stick, a Native American coup stick which is very, it's such a great moment to have one of those, because it's a game that Native Americans would play. They'd walk into another nation, touch them, and say, okay, tag, you're it.
That's great.
We've got something in common. It's called North Carolina. And the thing is that what is up with our system down here? I mean, is it because prisons are big business?
Well, there used to be a thing called the military-industrial complex, and now there's the prison-industrial complex. And so, what happened, I think, as a result of all the drug laws that were passed in the 70s and 80s that sort of ratcheted up the penalties, you had huge numbers of people sent to prison for the first time, really overwhelming the system. And so prisons started being built, and they were often built in small communities where the land was cheap. And so those communities ended up being supported by the prison and by the other businesses that supported the prison. And it became very hard at that point to cut back because you were cutting back on folks' jobs and livelihood. And I think that's where we are right now. We have many, many prisons. We have a lot of prison cells. And now we're recognizing that we really didn't need to be incarcerating quite so many people.
You're so right about that, because, I mean, it's like growing up in the state of Montana, we had one prison. It was up in Deer Lodge. But when you cruise through North Carolina, I mean, every county, has got some sort of prison for something. I mean, the one that scares me the most is the one in Anson County.
With good reason, with very good reason. I've got a case right now against the Anson County Sheriff's Department, which I can't really talk about, but I represented a fellow by the name of Floyd Brown, who spent 13 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, coming out of Anson County.
Wow. Why does the justice system get it wrong? And why are they holding back physical evidence? Is it an ego thing? They just don't want to have the weight of that they could be wrong?
Here's what I think happens, Arrow. Police walk into a scene, and as a result of their experience, and I'm talking now about major scenes, where detectives are walking in, and they form a pretty quick theory about what they think happened. Just to give you an example, out of North Carolina, I represented a doctor who was charged with murdering his wife. The police initially looked at a handyman who had a record, who had been a worker at their house. But as soon as they found out that the husband had had an affair with a nurse, that was all it took. And they spent the next 4 years trying to find evidence to link him to the murder, unsuccessfully. And so, they develop a theory, and then you have confirmation bias. And all of us suffer from confirmation bias. Once we have a theory, we tend to ignore the evidence or the facts that are not consistent with our theory, and we focus on the facts that support our theory. And that's what happens in these cases for the most part. And interestingly enough, the real problem comes when somebody is really innocent, because there's not a lot of actual evidence because they're innocent. And so what ends up happening is that the police, they may put extra pressure on the suspect to get him to make admissions. And depending on who the person is, sometimes that extra pressure works. Or they bring in an expert, a blood spatter expert, who comes in and testifies in ways that support their theory, but which are not based in science at all. Or they create a identification procedure, a lineup or a show up or a photo ID that's suggestive, and that leads the eyewitness to identify the wrong person. So it's not a question of them trying to set up or frame an innocent person. It's a question of human nature and human fallacy and human weakness and human psychology. And the problem is that there's no control on that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these detectives are left to their own devices. And when things go wrong, no one really studies why they went wrong. You know, when a plane crashes, the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, comes out and they conduct this incredible investigation, even a single plane crashing, because they want to find out what happened and why it happened and how it can be prevented. We never do that in cases of wrongful conviction. I'm not aware of it ever being done. And that's a real problem.
The case you were talking about with the woman that was murdered and the handyman as well as the gentleman, is that the one that took place here in Charlotte where it was the doctor?
Exactly.
Oh, my God, because WBT helped reopen that case. And I was in that building when all of that was taking place.
Oh, yeah. No, that was the Ed Friedland case. Kim Thomas was the victim. And Marion Gales was the handyman.
Yep.
And Ed endured 4 years of investigation. The police hid from the DA all the evidence about Marion Gales. The DA had no idea. It came out after Ed was indicted. He lost his medical practice. Once we figured out that there was all this evidence against Gales, and we figured out that the medical examiner who the police had recruited out of New York had given essentially worthless testimony, the charges against Ed were dismissed.
Yep.
But his life was ruined.
Yep.
He had to move. His medical practice was a shambles. And it was a travesty of justice that I'm not sure Ed really ever recovered from.
Well, you're right about that, because I'll tell you what, because we used to see the doctor all the time. Being a part of the broadcast community and stuff like that, you'd bump into him at lunch or you'd bump into him at a movie. He was just an everyday average guy. We always just knew him as the doctor. And then all of a sudden something tragic like this takes place and you're going, oh my God, I can't breathe.
No, that's exactly right. And Ed, look, Ed had some prickly aspects to his personality. He was from New York, mm-hmm. and he could be sarcastic, and he could be sort of dismissive of the police. And I think, he sort of pissed him off by his attitude. But he sure wasn't a murderer.
Yeah.
He once the police started targeting him, his life was in shambles.
Now, was it part of the evidence? I mean, you talk about American injustice. The fact that he comes home, he learns about his wife, and he didn't cry, so they thought, he did it.
There you go. I mean, you're right on the money. A big part of their case is he didn't act right. Mm-hmm. When he came into the house and found this horrendous scene, he didn't go running over to her body and try to revive her. And so that he acted abnormally and not the way the police would have wanted him to react. And therefore it was suspicious. Did they take into account that he had just worked the entire day at 3 different hospitals and walked in and was in shock and found his, 10-month-old baby crying in the crib, and, who knows what was going on through his mind? That became irrelevant, because the only thing that was relevant was he didn't act right.
With so much time and money that goes into forensic, why is it so often ignored? Because, this right here are the puzzle pieces.
Well, the problem is not that forensics are ignored. The problem is, I think, that they are given inordinate weight. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. In the Friedland case, the time of death became critical because Ed had an absolute alibi. He had been at 3 different hospitals all day long, seeing patients from 8 a.m. until he got home at 10 p.m. that night. So he could not have committed this crime at any point during those hours. Therefore, the police had to establish that she must have died before 8 a.m. But there was no evidence that she had died before 8 a.m. So they found a medical examiner in New York who will remain nameless for now. And he talked with them on the phone. At first, he told them he couldn't really help them. But then somehow or another, he decided that through measuring the potassium in the vitreous humor of the victim's eye, he could come up with a time of death within plus or minus 30 minutes.
Wow.
And so based on that, he opined and wrote in a report that she had been killed before 8 a.m. It was on that basis that Ed was indicted. When I started doing the research into that, all of the research, all of the studies that have been done said that if you study the level of potassium in the vitreous humor of an eye, it gives you a range of time of death of plus or minus 6 hours.
Oh, no. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. And so, we had a hearing with this expert. We had a very good judge, Marvin Gray, who has since passed. And Judge Gray allowed me to cross-examine this expert outside the presence of a jury before trial even started. And based on the evidence, held that he could not testify because there was not a scientific basis for his testimony.
Wow.
So that's the kind of stuff that happens. Now, if we hadn't been able to prove that it was false evidence, Ed might very well have ended up on death row.
Wow. How much does the blind gorilla theory participate with a lot of these cases where they, it's like, well, that's what they say happened, then it must have happened. But yet, with the blind gorilla, though, I mean, it's always two different sides of a story.
Well, there is always two sides of the story, and what I hope readers take away from the book is that they need to be skeptical about allegations. Not that, look, most of the time the allegations turn out to have a basis in fact. So I'm not here to say the police are evil or that they're setting out to frame innocent people. They thought Ed Friedland was guilty. Yep. And they set out to prove he was guilty instead of setting out to find out what happened to his wife.
So I was going to say, was this pre-DNA, this case? Because, I don't remember DNA ever coming up in anything that was ever talked about.
No, it was pre-DNA. It was the case. She was murdered in 1990, and DNA really was just starting to be used at that point. It really took off in the mid-90s. And interestingly enough, they found some DNA decades later. It wasn't Ed's, but they couldn't tie it to any particular person.
Wow. Your book talks about the poverty as well as racism as being as what's really infected our criminal system. But in the case of Ed, though, the doctor, I remember people talking about, well, they're going to take down the doctor. It's people that have a lot of recognition as well that get, put into bad situations.
The truth is that it could have happened to anybody. Yeah. Anybody, whether he was a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, a businessman, or just the average worker, going about his daily job. Anybody in that situation could have been subjected to exactly the same thing. The difference might have been that Ed had the resources to fight it. Yes. Whereas if he was poor, his public defender might not have had the resources necessary to fight it, or the time, because it was enormously time consuming. So that's the problem when it hits the average person.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that average person, how do you react when the public doesn't agree with the verdict? It's almost like no. Look, we got to play this game over again because I don't agree with what that jury said.
Well, the problem is that they weren't sitting in the courtroom. Right. And you get a very superficial and skewed view from news reports of what happens in a trial. No matter how accurate the reporter is trying to be, they're sitting in a courtroom for 7 or 8 hours, and they have a minute on TV to explain it, or they have 10 column inches in a newspaper to explain it. They can't do it justice, and so what they focus in on are the things that hit them as being most important, and maybe they were, but maybe they weren't. And so the public is sitting there, and they're getting a partial story of what happened in court.
Yep, armchair quarterbacks.
So, yeah, well, and you know, can't blame them. I mean, that's the information they're being given. But again, they need to understand that what's happening in the courtroom is far more complex and nuanced than what's being reported to them after the fact.
I've never understood the interrogation system in the way that when my wife's mother was murdered, she actually, when she was being interrogated, she actually started questioning herself. Did I do this? And she's going, no, I didn't do this, but they're making me feel like that I did do this.
Well, you know, there's a technique that's called the Reed technique. John Reed was a Chicago, I guess he was a detective at some point, but he came up with this system that is very effective in getting people to confess when they've committed a crime. You know, it involves guilt, it involves doubt. You know, they start talking about, well, is it possible you did this and you just don't remember it? If somebody had been drinking or doing drugs or has some mental issue, they play on that. And they isolate the person. They don't give them any support. There's a whole psychological dynamic to it. And it's very effective to get guilty people to confess. The problem is it's equally effective to get innocent people to make admissions. You know, it's an admission machine. And so when it's used on somebody who is innocent, it often results in statements, admissions, that are not accurate. And you know, I don't know what happened in your situation, but that's the technique that most police officers in the United States, or most detectives at least, have been trained in. And it's only recently, in the last decade or so, that there's been a recognition that that technique is not a good technique to use, because it does result in false confessions and false admissions. And so now there's some scientific studies that are being done about other techniques that are used in Great Britain and other places that are very different.
Yeah, you talked about that starting up in Chicago. That's exactly where that crime took place, was in Chicago. That's where my wife is from. So, I mean, it's like, wow, she was like right there in the center of it.
Well, you know, there's an infamous detective in Chicago named John Burge. He was the head of the Homicide Bureau, I believe, and he is personally responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements on wrongful conviction cases coming out of Chicago.
Wow. Fabricating and planting evidence. I mean, to me, that's just a Hollywood thing, but does it really take place?
Oh, absolutely it takes place. You know, and again, well, you know, let's take a controversial case. Let's take the O.J. Simpson case. And let's assume that O.J. Simpson was guilty, you know, because I think a lot of people feel he was, and I get that. But what happened in that case, I think, was that the detective didn't think he had enough evidence. And so blood ended up being, I believe, planted at the scene. And Barry Scheck, who was the person who was doing the forensics for the defense, found in that blood the preservative that's used when blood is taken from a suspect and preserved for future testing. So in other words, they had taken blood from OJ in order to compare it to blood at the scene. They had put a preservative in it to keep it for a long period of time. And then at least it appears as though the detective there had spread it in various places, because when Barry tested it, that blood had that preservative, which is not natural in your body. So, you know, I think that's a big reason why OJ got acquitted, is because the jury decided that if that happened, they couldn't trust anything that the prosecution was saying.
Wow. David, you got to come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm happy to do it. So you just find a time when I can come back.
We'll meet over there in Lexington so we can have some of their barbecue, because that's the sweetest barbecue on the planet.
Absolutely true.
Well, you have a brilliant day today, okay?
Thank you very much, Arrow. I appreciate it.
You bet. Bye, Guy.
Barbecue.